The thing that unsettled me most was not the size of them. People always think it would be the size. 7 feet standing upright. Maybe more when the shoulders rolled high and the spine straightened. They think it would be the teeth or the smell or the sound they made in the dark. But it was the way they watched the fire. Not like animals, not even close. The larger one used to sit beyond the tree line every night while the pine knots cracked inside the stovepipe and the snow hissed against the cabin roof. He would stay perfectly still for hours. I could never fully see his face through the timber. Only the eyes. Amber in winter, almost green in rain, and every single night he waited for the same thing. The harmonica. I know how stupid that sounds. You clicked on this because you wanted a monster story. Maybe you think I am some lonely old man trying to scare strangers on the internet before my heart gives out. Truth is, I almost hope you think that. The real version is worse, because I was trained to identify predators. I spent 26 years working wildlife population surveys across Montana and northern Idaho. Wolves, black bears, cougars, elk migration, predation patterns. I carried tranquilizer rifles longer than most men carry lunchboxes. I testified in hearings about animal behavior. Universities quoted my field reports. State agencies used my numbers. And I am telling you plainly that what lived in those mountains was not a bear, not a wolf, not anything science has admitted exists. The first winter I heard them crying outside the cabin, I thought somebody had abandoned hunting dogs. That was my first real mistake. The crying came from the ravine behind the creek, thin at first, high-pitched, wet-sounding, like lungs filling with fluid between breaths. I remember the exact night because freezing rain had sealed the porch steps under clear ice, and I nearly broke my wrist carrying wood inside. The sound came again while I was stacking logs beside the stove. 3 cries, then silence. Not natural silence either. Deliberate silence. The kind that settles across a forest when every living thing decides at once to shut up. No wind moving through the firs, no owl calls, no branch movement. Just the creek. I should explain where this happened before people start inventing nonsense in the comments. The cabin sat 63 miles north of Lowell, near a stretch of federal timberland that most maps barely bothered naming. Burn scar country, old logging cuts, ravines deep enough to swallow radio signals. There were abandoned fire roads everywhere, half of them washed out. The nearest town had fewer than 400 people and one gas pump that only worked when the owner kicked it. I moved there after my divorce. Funny how men always pretend they leave civilization for noble reasons. Simpler life, nature, solitude. Truth is, most of us are just running from rooms that got too quiet. My wife left 5 winters before this story began. Breast cancer took my daughter 2 years after that. By the time I turned 63, I had learned that grief changes shape but never weight. It sits on you the same every morning. So I disappeared into the woods because the woods never asked questions. I bought the cabin cheap from a retired trapper who warned me 3 separate times not to wander north of the creek after dark. He never explained why. At the time, I assumed he was drunk. Now I know better. That first night with the crying, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch wearing nothing except long johns and wool socks inside rubber boots. The cold hit hard enough to burn my lungs. Ice glazed every branch in silver. The crying stopped immediately. I swept the flashlight through the trees. Nothing. Then I noticed the tracks. There were 2 sets circling the cabin. Not canine, not exactly. The stride was wrong. That is the detail people never understand. Predators move with purpose. Wolves conserve motion. Bears lumber. Cougars place feet carefully. These tracks looked almost thoughtful. Each print sank deep into the slush, 4 claw marks visible at the front, but the rear pad stretched too long, almost human. I followed them 20 yards before my flashlight landed on the elk carcass. Fresh kill, still steaming. Its rib cage had been opened cleanly, not torn apart, opened, and beside the body sat a smooth river stone. That stone matters. You need to remember it, because it appeared 3 times over the year I lived among them. The first time was beside that elk. The second time cost me everything. The third time still waits on my windowsill while I record this. The stone was gray with a white stripe through the center, small enough to fit in my palm, wet despite the freezing air. I bent down to inspect it. That was when something exhaled behind me. Not growled, not barked. Exhaled. Slow and heavy. I turned so fast, I slipped in the mud and nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam caught eyes first, low to the ground. 2 of them. Young. They stood at the edge of the trees staring directly at me, covered in dark-soaked fur, long arms hanging awkwardly beside narrow chests. Pups. That word sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it was the only thing my brain could reach for. One tilted its head, the other stepped backward immediately. Different personalities. I recognized that even then. The curious one stayed near the light. The nervous one vanished into darkness. Then something larger moved behind them. The forest itself seemed to rise. I heard branches crack high above ground level. 8 feet, maybe. 9. The flashlight flickered once, and every instinct I had from decades in the wilderness screamed the same message. Run. Instead, I crouched slowly beside the elk and backed away without taking my eyes off the tree line. I remember saying something stupid under my breath. Easy now. Easy. Like they were frightened horses. The smaller one made a sound I still hear in dreams sometimes. Not aggressive, curious, almost questioning. Then the big one growled, deep enough to vibrate through my ribs. The pups vanished instantly. So did I. I locked myself inside the cabin and sat awake with my rifle across my knees until dawn. I told myself they were malformed wolves. I told myself exhaustion was twisting proportions in the dark. I told myself grief can make lonely men imagine impossible things. Looking back, that was the moment I still could have left. I could have packed the truck the next morning and driven south forever. Instead, I walked back to the carcass after sunrise. The elk was gone. Every piece. Only blood remained in the snow. And another river stone sat exactly where the body had been. Same white stripe, same smooth surface. Placed carefully upright. Like a gift. By the time spring returned to the mountains the following year, I had stopped measuring time the way normal people do, because isolation changes the structure of memory until days become attached less to calendars and more to weather patterns, animal sounds, and the specific quality of light moving through the trees at dusk. I remembered mornings by frost, weeks by storms, months by whether Abel still slept near the stove or farther from the fire. Civilization had become something distant and strangely artificial inside my mind by then, almost like an old dream fading around the edges. And that frightened me more than the creatures ever did. The snow melted slowly that spring, revealing black earth beneath the drifts around Cain's grave, while creek waters swelled loud enough to echo through the valley day and night. Abel spent long hours sitting beside the mound during those weeks, sometimes perfectly still for hours at a time. Mourning has rituals even among things we do not understand. I believe that now. The scarred creature never returned openly after winter, though signs of the others remained everywhere. Once thaw softened the ground enough to hold tracks again. Massive prints along ridge trails, broken trees near the Northern Territory line. fresh kills left half-eaten beside creek beds, and always that feeling, observation. One afternoon in April, I found another symbol carved into cedar bark roughly half a mile south of the outpost. The circle crossed through the middle, closer than before. Not random wandering, encroachment. Abel reacted badly when he smelled it. He paced around the tree repeatedly while emitting those same low, anxious sounds I remembered from the storm months earlier before Cain died. Then suddenly, he struck the trunk with both hands hard enough to tear bark loose completely. Anger. Not fear this time. Anger. That mattered because, until then, Abel had always avoided confrontation whenever possible. He was curious, gentle in his own strange way. Cain had carried the aggression between them, but grief changes living things, even creatures built for violence. The transformation happened gradually over the following months. Abel grew larger by early summer, broader shoulders, thicker neck, new scars appearing across his arms and chest from fights I never witnessed directly. He spent more time patrolling beyond the valley and less time resting near the outpost listening to music. Yet he always returned before dawn. Always. That became the new rule between us. No matter how far he ranged into the mountains, no matter how violent the night sounded beyond the ridges, Abel returned before sunrise and rested beside the doorway, while morning fog drifted through the trees. I depended on that certainty more than I realized. The human mind clings desperately to patterns during chaos, especially lonely minds. Around June, I made one final expedition north despite every instinct warning against it, because questions rot inside people when left unanswered too long. Part of me still needed proof beyond memory. Another part needed to understand why Cain fought so desperately to keep those creatures away from the valley. And perhaps the ugliest truth is this. I wanted to know whether Abel eventually belonged with them instead of me. The Northern Territory looked different by summer. Not physically, emotionally. The forest carried a pressure to it I cannot explain properly. Fewer birds, fewer insects, silence settling too heavily beneath the trees even during daylight hours. Several old elk carcasses lay scattered across ravines with bones arranged strangely afterward. Not feeding remains, displays, territory markers. I followed tracks uphill for nearly 3 hours through dense cedar growth before finding the place. The den. Not a cave exactly. An abandoned mining tunnel from the 1930s carved deep into the mountainside and partially collapsed by landslides decades earlier. Massive claw marks scarred the entrance stone while old animal bones littered the surrounding slope. And hanging from nearby branches, human objects, rusting lanterns, children's shoes, license plates, backpacks shredded by weather, trophies, warnings, history. I should have turned back immediately. Instead, I stepped closer, because human curiosity can overpower terror right up until the moment consequences arrive. The smell coming from the tunnel hit first, wet fur, decay, old blood, and beneath all that something almost chemical, like damp stone sealed away from sunlight for generations. Then I heard movement deeper inside. Several sets of movement. Large, slow, watching. The darkness beyond the tunnel mouth shifted subtly, eyes reflecting. More than I could count. At least one pair sat nearly 8 feet above ground level. The scarred creature stepped into view first, still alive, still enormous. Its muzzle carried fresh damage from the fight with Cain months earlier, including one ruined eye clouded pale beneath the shadows. Yet the thing standing there looked less animal now than ever before. Age had settled into it. Awareness, calculation. Behind it, more shapes moved slowly through the tunnel darkness, while low, clicking sounds passed between them. Communication again. The scarred creature stared at me for several long seconds, then tilted its head slightly, almost curious. I realized suddenly that I had crossed into their world the same way hikers wander accidentally into war zones without understanding the boundaries around them. Not prey. Intruder. The creature stepped closer. I raised the rifle immediately, and to my horror it looked amused by the gesture. Then, from somewhere behind me, Abel growled. Deep. Violent. I turned just enough to glimpse him standing among the trees downhill with shoulders raised and teeth fully bared toward the tunnel entrance. The reaction inside the den happened instantly. Growls answered from the darkness. Movement surged. The scarred creature stared at Abel for a long moment while tension rippled visibly through every body around the tunnel. Hierarchy challenge. That was what I witnessed. Not because of me, because Abel had returned. Changed. Older. No longer the frightened younger creature hiding from storms beside my porch. The scarred one clicked its teeth sharply. Abel answered with a roar so powerful it echoed down the entire mountainside, and for one terrible second I thought war would erupt right there. Instead, the older creature slowly stepped aside. Not submission, recognition. The others behind it withdrew deeper into the tunnel shadows afterward, while Abel remained motionless among the trees. Then the scarred creature looked directly at me and spoke. Leave, one word, clear, undeniable. The sound came rough and broken, but the meaning landed perfectly. Not mimicry anymore. Language. Cold ran through me despite the summer heat because hearing real speech from something humanity called myth shattered the last stable piece of reality inside my head. The creature understood the effect, too. I saw it in the eyes. Awareness. Something older than human patience. I backed away slowly without lowering the rifle, while Abel watched both me and the tunnel entrance. The scarred creature never moved. It only watched until the trees swallowed the den behind us. The hike back south passed mostly in silence. Abel paced through the timber several yards away while neither of us looked directly at the other much. Something had changed between us, because for the first time I understood a painful truth. Abel did not belong to me, never had. I was simply the lonely human who wandered briefly into his life. That realization stayed with me all summer, and deep down, I think Abel understood it too. Winter closed over the valley hard after Cain died. The silence left behind felt heavier than the storms, because some presences become structural after enough time passes. You stop noticing them until they vanish. Every morning afterward, I still looked toward the tree line expecting to see Cain standing there, watching, listening, guarding, and every morning the woods answered with nothing. The cabin was gone, except for the stone chimney and burned floorboards buried beneath snow, so Abel and I moved into an abandoned ranger outpost 2 miles south near the old fire road where I stored emergency supplies years earlier. The place barely deserved the word cabin. One room, rusted stove, cold drafts slipping through cracked walls, but it stayed hidden beneath thick pine cover, and hidden mattered now, especially after what happened. The sheriff finally reached the valley once the storm cleared enough for trucks to pass safely, though by then most evidence had vanished beneath fresh snowfall and ash. I told them the fire started from an overturned lantern during a mountain lion attack. Nobody questioned the story much. Remote places survive on selective blindness. The sheriff did notice the claw marks across the truck doors and shattered porch beams before the fire consumed everything. Bare damage. That became the official explanation. People hear what they need to hear. Before leaving, the sheriff handed me a paper bag containing the harmonica recovered from the snow beside the burned porch. Melted slightly along one edge. Still playable. Funny, the things that survive fires. Abel refused to go near the old cabin site after the burial. Even passing close to the clearing made him tense. He kept stopping to scent the air while staring toward the deeper forest. The others remained nearby. We both knew it. Some nights, distant howls drifted across the ridges north of the valley, while Abel sat awake beside the stove, listening without moving. He never answered any more. Exile. That was what he became after defending me. Not fully theirs, not fully mine. Something stranded between worlds. The loneliness inside that realization nearly killed me, worse than fear ever did. Winter grew brutal early that year. The creek froze solid before Christmas while survival pushed grief into routine. I hunted constantly. Elk when possible, rabbits when necessary. Abel ranged farther south searching for food while avoiding the Northern Territory completely. But the strangest thing was how ordinary life between us slowly became afterward. Not safe. Never safe. Just familiar. At night, we sat beside the stove listening to wind hammer the trees outside while snow hissed softly against the windows. Sometimes, Abel arranged collected objects beside his sleeping corner, the same way he once arranged stones near the creek. Feathers, antlers, old coins. One cracked pair of children's glasses found somewhere deep in the woods. That last object unsettled me badly. Not because I thought Abel killed anyone, because I realized how long these creatures had probably lived beside us unseen. Watching generations pass, collecting fragments, learning. During those winter months, I talked aloud often just to fill the silence. Stories about military deployments. Stories about my failed marriage. Stories about my daughter learning to fish beside northern lakes. Abel listened to all of it. Always. And sometimes he answered with low rumbling sounds, carrying emotional tones that no longer felt accidental. Sympathy, curiosity, sadness. I know how impossible that sounds. Believe me. I spent most of my life studying predator behavior through measurable science. But once you share grief beside another living thing long enough, certainty begins breaking apart. One night near New Year's, the temperature dropped so violently that ice formed inside the windows, despite the stove burning nonstop. Sometime after midnight, I woke because Abel stood frozen beside the doorway, staring into the darkness outside. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Circling the outpost. Not hiding, testing. I reached for the rifle while Abel emitted a low warning growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The footsteps stopped beside the wall nearest the stove. Silence followed. Then 3 scratches dragged slowly across the wood outside. Not random. Deliberate. My pulse slammed hard enough to blur vision because I recognized the pattern instantly. The circle crossed through the middle, the same symbol from the destroyed trail camera. Abel backed away, visibly trembling, while another scrape carved through the timber. Then a voice whispered through the storm. Robert, soft, patient, almost amused, the scarred one, still alive, still hunting. I fired through the wall immediately. The rifle blast exploded through the tiny cabin while wood splintered outward into the snow. Then came movement, fast retreating footsteps crashing toward the forest. Abel lunged for the door. No, I grabbed him before he could charge outside. Easy. The words sounded absurd, coming from me because my own hands shook uncontrollably. But Abel stopped, breathing hard, listening. Eventually, the woods quieted again except for wind moving through the trees. Neither of us slept afterward. That was the winter paranoia truly settled into me. Every sound carried threat afterward. Every snapped branch beyond the firelight tightened my stomach instantly. And occasionally, people vanished. Never enough for national attention. just enough for local fear. A trapper disappearing near the ridge trails. Hunters abandoning camp during heavy snowfall. Tracks dismissed publicly as misidentified bears. The pattern continued because remote communities survive by normalizing impossible things. One afternoon in February, I found fresh prints circling Kane's grave after a storm, at least 6 sets. Large, deliberate. But the grave itself remained untouched. Respect or warning. I could not decide which frightened me more. Abel stood beside the grave for a long time while weak sunlight filtered through bare branches overhead. Snow drifted softly across the valley, while another howl echoed faintly from far north. Abel answered once. Short, mournful, then silence returned. Standing there, I realized these creatures probably carried histories older than our understanding of wilderness itself. Territory, burial rituals, hierarchy, exile. Maybe even myths passed between generations in whatever language existed among them, and humanity walked blindly along the edges of all it, pretending we were alone. That realization changed me permanently, not because it made the creatures less dangerous, because it made the world larger and lonelier, obeying. Within seconds, the forest swallowed them completely, leaving only wind, fire, and Kane dying beside the porch. I crawled toward him through slush and ash while smoke rolled overhead thick enough to sting my eyes raw. Abel stayed pressed against Kane's body, making those same low, heartbreaking sounds, while flames consumed the cabin behind us. Kane looked at me once. Just once. And despite the blood flooding from his throat, there was no fear left in his eyes, only exhaustion. He had done what he intended to do. Protected the valley, protected Abel, protected me. I remember kneeling there in the snow with my hands covered in blood, while the only home I had left burned behind us. And somewhere inside that terrible moment, I finally understood the thing I had refused to admit all year. These creatures were not hiding from humanity because they were mindless predators. They were hiding because they knew exactly what humanity would do if we discovered them. Kane died before dawn. The fire burned out soon after, leaving only blackened beams rising through the snow like broken ribs. Abel never left Kane's side through any of it. Not while the body cooled, not while ash drifted across the clearing, not even when weak daylight finally pushed through the trees. I buried Kane near the creek where I first found the elk carcass months earlier. Found him there, lost him there. The ground had frozen hard enough that digging took nearly 6 hours with a shovel and splitting maul. Abel stayed beside me the entire time, carrying stones, clearing dirt, watching the northern woods constantly. And when the grave was finished, Abel placed one final river stone atop the mound. Gray, white stripe through the center, now stained dark with Kane's blood. By then, I understood the whole story had always been about that stone. Exchange, warning, memory, love. I sat beside the grave until nightfall while snow drifted softly through the trees, and eventually Abel lowered himself beside the mound with his head resting against the frozen earth where Kane lay beneath. Then, very quietly, almost lost beneath the wind, he made the first broken notes of the harmonica melody. And I finally started crying. The first snow arrived unusually early that year, dusting the ridges before September fully ended, and by then the valley no longer felt governed by ordinary rules because fear had settled into every corner of it like smoke trapped inside old walls. Kane survived the attack in the ravine. Barely. Getting him back to the cabin took 4 hours because his left leg no longer supported weight properly. And several times during the descent I honestly thought he might kill me from pain alone whenever the limb shifted against loose rocks. Abel stayed pressed against Kane's side the entire journey, while I carried lanterns and improvised splints through deepening darkness. And more than once I heard movement pacing us through the trees uphill, never visible, always there. That became the pattern afterward. Watching. The feeling of being observed turned constant once autumn closed over the mountains. Even during daylight I caught movement between distant trunks or heard branches crack somewhere beyond sight while working near the cabin. Kane noticed it too. His injuries kept him near the clearing, but every few minutes his head lifted sharply toward the forest, with lips curled back from his teeth. Waiting for another attack. Waiting for war. And slowly, despite every rational instinct left inside me, I started preparing alongside them. You need to understand how isolation distorts morality after enough time passes. By then, I had spent nearly a year hiding impossible creatures from the world while convincing myself I was protecting something innocent. The line between protector and accomplice had already blurred long before I admitted it. So, I reinforced doors, stockpiled ammunition, set motion alarms along the creek bed. Not because I feared Cain and Abel, because I feared whatever hunted them. That realization alone should tell you how far gone my thinking had become. The valley changed quickly once colder weather pushed animals downhill toward winter feeding grounds. Deer moved through in nervous silent groups. Coyotes disappeared entirely. Twice I found elk carcasses torn apart near the northern trails, with whole sections missing as though something enormous had fed while moving. Travel kills. Territorial expansion. Those patterns belonged to predators under pressure. One afternoon during freezing rain, I climbed the western ridge to repair a damaged trail camera and found something that still wakes me some nights even now. The camera had been crushed completely flat against a tree trunk. Not bitten, squeezed. The steel housing looked compressed by impossible force, and above it, carved deep into the bark with claw marks nearly half an inch wide, sat a crude symbol resembling a circle crossed through the middle. Not random damage, communication. That was the moment I stopped pretending instinct alone explained what lived out there. Back at the cabin, Abel reacted violently when I showed him the broken camera. He backed away from the symbol immediately, while distressed sounds rattled through his throat. Fear. Real fear. Cain limped closer afterward and stared at the mark for nearly a full minute before turning slowly toward the northern mountains. Then he growled, quietly, like hatred. The weather worsened through October until cold rain soaked the valley almost daily, and fog drifted low enough through the trees that visibility sometimes vanished completely beyond the clearing. Those conditions changed the creatures too. Abel grew restless. Cain barely slept. Several nights I heard distant howls echoing across the ridges in layered, overlapping voices that sounded wrong in ways difficult to describe. Not wolves, too deliberate, almost conversational, and always answered eventually by Cain. One voice against many. There was a night in late October when the full weight of what I had involved myself in finally became impossible to ignore. Frost covered the porch rails that morning, and by sunset thick clouds swallowed the valley completely, while wind pushed hard through the trees carrying the smell of snow. Cain positioned himself near the tree line before darkness fully settled. Watching north, Abel stayed beside the porch unusually close to me while I cleaned knives near the fire pit. Then every motion alarm along the creek activated at once, one after another. Sharp, metallic chimes echoing through the dark. East, west, north, surrounding us. Cain rose immediately despite the injured leg. The growl that came out of him did not sound animal anymore. It sounded furious. Abel backed against the porch steps, trembling visibly, while the alarms continued clanging through the valley. Then they stopped. All together. Silence dropped over the clearing so suddenly my ears rang from it. No wind, no insects, nothing. I reached slowly for the rifle, leaning beside the doorway, and from somewhere beyond the trees, a voice called out, "Human, or almost human, help me." The words came broken and strained, as if spoken by someone who had learned the language incorrectly from listening through walls. Abel reacted instantly. Pure panic. He grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and started pulling me backward toward the cabin while Cain snarled toward the darkness with every hair along his shoulders standing upright. The voice came again, "Please." Closer this time. Wrong. God help me, it sounded wrong. Not because the words themselves were unnatural, because there was no emotion behind them at all. Just imitation, like a recording played through damaged speakers. I should have barricaded the door immediately. Instead, I stepped forward. Military training, search and rescue instinct, human stupidity, pick whichever explanation you prefer. I swept the flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Then the beam landed on eyes. 4 sets, high above ground level. Massive shapes stood among the timber beyond the creek, while pale light reflected across wet fur and enormous shoulders. Larger than Cain. Much larger. One stepped forward enough for me to see the face. Not canine like Abel, not even close. Older, broader, the muzzle shorter, the eyes deeply sunken. Scars covering almost every visible inch of skin, and hanging around its neck was human clothing. Not worn, collected. Several jackets tied together with rope and wire. Trophies. The creature smiled. I know what I saw. Do not tell me predators cannot smile. This thing understood intimidation. Then it spoke again. "Help me." Clearer now, mocking. The voice came from deep inside its chest beneath the growling. Not true speech, mimicry. Every hair on my body stood upright instantly, because in that moment I understood exactly what had happened to those missing campers and livestock and vanished dogs across the valley. These creatures had learned us, studied us, maybe for generations. Cain lunged forward before I could react. The roar exploding from him shook snow loose from branches overhead, while the larger creatures answered instantly from the trees. Chaos erupted. Movement everywhere. Dark shapes crashing through timber. Abel dragged me backward toward the cabin almost violently, while Cain collided with the nearest creature near the creek bank, hard enough to snap young pine trunks sideways. The sounds that followed still haunt me worse than the visuals. Wet impacts, snarling, something screaming in a voice almost human. I fired twice into the darkness without aiming properly because everything moved too fast to track clearly beneath the flashlight beam. One of the larger creatures vanished into the trees immediately after the second shot, while another circled wide along the edge of the clearing. Flanking, strategic movement, not random attack behavior. Cain slammed against the porch steps moments later with blood pouring from a fresh wound across his throat, while the massive, scarred creature advanced slowly behind him through the snow. And that was when Abel did something I never expected. He stood between me and them, small compared to the others. Terrified, but standing there anyway with shoulders raised and teeth bared toward his own kind. The larger creature stopped. For several seconds, nobody moved. Wind hissed through the trees around us, carrying snow across the clearing, while Cain struggled weakly to rise beside the porch. Then the scarred creature made a low clicking sound. Abel answered immediately. Back and forth. Communication. Argument, maybe, I will never know. But suddenly, the larger creature looked directly at me. And in a voice shredded raw from mimicry, it spoke 3 words. Not prey. Ours. Narrative bombshell. That was the moment the entire shape of reality shifted inside my head forever. Because ownership means culture, possession, hierarchy, society. And before I could process any of it, Cain exploded forward one final time. August arrived carrying heat that sat over the valley like wet cloth. And those weeks marked the exact point where everything beautiful inside the story began rotting from underneath, even though I refused to admit it at the time, because human beings have an astonishing ability to ignore warning signs once love becomes involved. And yes, that is the correct word. Not because they were human, not because I forgot what they could do, but because care repeated long enough changes shape into attachment whether we want it to or not. The warning signs started small. That is how catastrophe always begins. Small enough to explain away. One evening, near the middle of August, I found the remains of a black bear cub, half buried beside the creek, roughly 200 yards north of the cabin. And at first I assumed Cain had killed it, defending territory, because predators clash constantly over food and space in remote wilderness zones. But the body bothered me immediately. The rib cage had been opened too cleanly. Not feeding damage. Inspection. Almost surgical. And the spine had been removed entirely. No scavenger marks anywhere else. I remember kneeling beside the carcass while flies buzzed thick around the blood-soaked dirt and thinking of battlefield injuries I had seen decades earlier overseas during military service. Because there is a certain deliberate brutality human beings recognize instinctively when they encounter it. Abel stood nearby, watching me quietly the entire time. Uneasy, not proud, uneasy, that mattered. Looking back, I can see now he already understood something I did not. The next sign came 3 nights later during one of the valley storms that rolled in after sunset with green lightning flashing through the clouds and thunder strong enough to rattle the windows. Abel arrived at the porch before the rain even started, pacing nervously while staring repeatedly toward the northern ridgeline. Cain never appeared. That alone felt wrong. He always returned before dark. Always. I played the harmonica anyway because the storms calmed Abel, and for nearly an hour he sat beside the porch steps listening while rain hammered the roof overhead and lightning flickered blue through the trees around us. Then, somewhere far north in the mountains, something screamed. Not wolf, not cougar, nothing natural. The sound carried impossible depth to it, like several voices layered together beneath one throat. Abel reacted instantly. Every hair along his body rose upright while a low, panicked growl vibrated through his chest. Then he did something he had never done before. He grabbed my sleeve. Hard. His claws punched through the fabric immediately and nicked skin beneath, but he barely seemed aware of it because his attention stayed fixed toward the forest while the scream echoed again through the valley. Closer. Much closer. I remember speaking calmly, even though my heart was slamming hard enough to hurt. Easy now. Easy. Abel looked directly into my eyes, and for one impossible second I saw unmistakable fear there. Human fear. Then Cain answered from somewhere beyond the creek with a roar so deep it physically shook the porch beneath us. The mountains fell silent afterward. Completely silent. Even the storm seemed quieter. Abel released my sleeve immediately and vanished into the darkness before I could stop him. I did not sleep at all that night. By morning, fresh tracks covered the mud around the clearing. Not 2 sets, 6. Every single one larger than Cain. That should have been enough. A sane man would have left that same day, packed the truck, burned the cabin if necessary, driven south until civilization returned. Instead, I convinced myself the territory dispute would pass. I told myself predators posture constantly without escalating into conflict. I told myself Cain knew how to protect the valley. Rationalization becomes a kind of addiction once fear and attachment intertwine. Toward the end of August, I made another terrible discovery while hiking west along an abandoned logging road near the ridgeline. The afternoon had turned strangely cold despite summer heat lingering below the mountains, and thick clouds moved low enough through the trees that visibility dropped to maybe 40 yards. I found the campsite first, or what remained of it. 2 tents shredded apart, coolers overturned, blood across the mud beside a dead fire pit, no bodies, no drag marks, nothing, just absence, the kind that feels louder than violence itself. I radioed the county station immediately from the truck, but even while speaking I already knew what had happened because the tracks surrounding the campsite matched the massive prints I had seen after the storm. Not Kane, something larger. The sheriff blamed bears publicly after the search teams found pieces of clothing downstream 3 days later. But I listened carefully during the briefing and noticed details they refused to discuss openly. No feeding signs, no scattered remains, no normal predation pattern, just disappearance. That night, Kane returned to the valley covered in blood that did not belong to him. Kane returned exhausted, older somehow, carrying a blood-stained river stone with a brass button from a missing search team member attached beneath it. At first, I thought it was a confession, but Kane's fearful growl toward the northern ridge revealed it was a warning. Soon, the valley descended into panic as livestock vanished. Power poles were torn down, and rumors spread of creatures stalking the mountains. Back at the cabin, Abel led me to a ravine where Kane lay mortally wounded after fighting multiple beasts alone. In that moment I understood the truth. Kane had sacrificed himself not as a predator, but as family. Always watching. That became the defining rhythm of life there. Eyes in the timber. Movement beyond the firelight. A constant awareness that I was never truly alone. And strangely enough, after enough months passed, I stopped resenting that feeling. The cabin itself changed too. I started leaving the porch lantern burning later into the evenings because Abel preferred sitting near the light while listening to the harmonica. Sometimes he rested beneath the awning during rainstorms with his long arms folded across his knees while I sat nearby sharpening knives or repairing gear. And there were moments when the entire scene felt almost ordinary until I remembered the creature beside me could split a mule deer open with one hand. That contrast never disappeared. Tenderness beside danger. Every single day. One humid evening in late June, I woke just before sunrise because something heavy brushed against the cabin wall outside my bedroom window, and for several seconds I lay perfectly still listening while rain tapped softly against the roof. Then I heard Abel whining quietly near the porch. Not distressed, concerned. I grabbed the rifle automatically and stepped outside. Kane lay beside the woodpile, bleeding heavily from his shoulder. The wound looked deep enough to expose bone beneath the wet black fur, and judging from the torn flesh across his ribs, something massive had clawed him repeatedly. Fresh blood mixed with rainwater beneath his body, while Abel paced nearby, making low nervous sounds in his throat. Kane growled the second he saw the rifle. Weak, but unmistakably threatening. Easy now. I remember raising one hand slowly, while rain soaked through my shirt almost instantly. "You are hurt. That is all." Kane stared at me for several long seconds with lips curled slightly back from his teeth, while Abel hovered anxiously between us. Then something happened that still unsettles me worse than all the violence later on. Abel walked directly to the medical kit hanging beside the porch door. Not randomly, intentionally. He pawed at the bag, then looked at me. I felt cold all over despite the summer rain, because that meant observation over time. Memory, association. He understood medicine, or at least the idea of help. Looking back, I should have refused right there. Some line still remained uncrossed before that moment. Feeding them was one thing. Studying behavior from a distance was another. But treating injuries changes a relationship permanently. You become responsible after that, Still, I carried the kit across the clearing and crouched slowly beside Kane while rainwater streamed from the trees overhead. The smell coming off the wound hit first. Blood. Wet fur. Infection already beginning underneath the torn tissue. Whatever attacked him had enormous claws, larger than his. That thought lodged itself deep in my stomach immediately. Kane trembled when I cleaned the wound with alcohol. Twice he snapped his jaws hard enough to crack the air beside my face, and every instinct screamed at me to back away. But Abel stayed beside him the entire time, making soft rumbling noises whenever Kane became agitated. Comforting him. The realization nearly distracted me from the danger itself. Eventually, I stitched the deepest gashes using veterinary sutures left over from an old elk relocation project years earlier. And by the time I finished, dawn had fully broken across the valley while steam rose from the wet grass around us. Kane never thanked me, but after I stood to leave, he lowered his massive head briefly against my shoulder. 1 second, maybe less. Then he pulled away. That tiny gesture haunted me for months afterward because affection from dangerous things feels intoxicating in ways ordinary people do not understand, especially lonely men. The wound kept Kane near the cabin for nearly 2 weeks while he recovered, and those days changed everything about the dynamic between us because distance vanished completely. For the first time, I saw how they interacted when they thought no humans were watching. Abel constantly brought him food, rabbits, fish. Once half a young deer dragged awkwardly across the clearing during heavy fog. Kane rarely ate first. He always nudged food toward Abel before touching it himself. Family, pack, something deeper than simple animal hierarchy. At night, they slept near the fire pit outside the cabin while I remained awake on the porch, listening to them communicate in low growls and strange clicking sounds that shifted constantly in rhythm and tone. Some patterns repeated often enough that I began recognizing emotional meaning behind them. Warnings, comfort, approval, questions. Language exists on a spectrum. That was the terrifying thing I started understanding during those months. Human beings like pretending intelligence belongs neatly to us alone, because it keeps the world organized inside our heads. Reality is messier. One evening during Kane's recovery, I made the mistake of asking a question out loud that I should never have spoken. "What are you?" The words escaped before I could stop them. Abel looked toward Kane immediately, and Kane looked directly back at me. Not confused, not reactive, considering. Then he turned slowly toward the northern ridgeline where the deeper wilderness stretched beyond sight, toward whatever waited out there. I did not sleep much after that. July brought heat waves strong enough to bake the valley dry during midday, and with the warmer weather came the first signs that something inside the forest was changing. Deer populations near the creek dropped suddenly. Birdsong disappeared from certain sections of timber entirely. Twice I found bear tracks moving rapidly south, as if fleeing the mountains rather than hunting through them. Animals know before we do. Always. Kane grew increasingly agitated as summer deepened. He spent more time patrolling the tree line around the cabin, and less time resting openly near the porch. Several nights I woke to violent snarling echoing somewhere high along the ridges north of the valley, followed by abrupt, unnatural silence. Each time Abel remained close to the cabin afterward, fearful, watching the darkness. That was also the summer I finally saw the full extent of Kane's intelligence. Late July, heavy heat, cicadas screaming through the trees loud enough to drown the creek. I was repairing fence posts near the old supply shed when Abel suddenly froze beside the clearing and emitted a sharp barking sound I had never heard before. Alarm. Kane burst from the timber instantly. Not running, charging. I turned just in time to see the mountain lion crouched atop the shed roof preparing to spring. Everything afterward happened fast. The lion launched. Kane intercepted it mid-air. The impact sounded like two men crashing through furniture. They hit the ground snarling and twisting violently while dirt and pine needles exploded across the clearing. I reached for the rifle leaning against the porch but stopped halfway there because Kane was handling the animal with horrifying efficiency. Not wild violence, controlled violence. That was worse. He pinned the lion beneath one arm while the other hand closed around its throat with terrifying precision. One twist, done. The whole attack lasted maybe 6 seconds. Then Kane looked directly at me, breathing hard, blood across his muzzle. Waiting. Not because he wanted praise, because he wanted to know if I understood what had just happened. Protection. Again. That night I sat outside long after dark with the harmonica in my hands, while Abel rested beside the porch steps, and Kane watched from the edge of the firelight. Warm wind moved softly through the trees, carrying smoke and pine resin across the valley. And for the first time since this story began, I remember thinking something truly dangerous. Maybe they are not the monsters here. That thought cost me everything later. Because once you start humanizing predators, you stop respecting the boundaries that keep people alive. March arrived with thaw water running beneath the snowpack, and long gray mornings where fog sat low across the valley until almost noon. And during those weeks, the distance between me and the creatures began shrinking in ways that now seem insane when I say them aloud, because there is no responsible scientific framework for what happened after that winter. No published paper, no behavioral chart, nothing clean enough to survive peer review, just memory and guilt. The younger ones started appearing near the cabin almost every evening once the weather softened. Always before sunset. Always alone at first. He moved with less fear every time, though I could tell caution had been drilled into him from birth because every unfamiliar sound still made the fur along his shoulders rise instantly. A snapped branch could stop him mid-step. A raven taking flight could send him retreating toward the trees, but curiosity always pulled him back. That curiosity became the bridge between us. I named him Abel sometime during early March, after finding him crouched beside the creek, arranging river stones into careful little circles near the waterline, while sleet rattled softly through the pine branches overhead. The name slipped into my mind unexpectedly because the sight carried something painfully gentle about it, and afterward I could never think of him as anything else. The larger one became Cain. Not because he was evil. That is the part that people misunderstand. Cain watched from the shadows because he understood danger better than Abel did. He carried old scars across his chest and muzzle. Torn ear, missing patch of fur near the spine. He had survived something violent long before I ever saw him. And unlike Abel, Cain never forgot I was human. The strange part is how quickly routine began replacing terror once spring settled across the mountains. Every evening I would carry scraps outside after dinner and leave them near the old stump beside the creek, while Abel lingered nearby, pretending not to watch me. Sometimes he approached before I reached the porch. Other nights he waited until darkness fully covered the valley. Always careful. Always studying. One rainy evening, I sat beneath the porch awning, cleaning trout beside a lantern while thunder rolled far off beyond the ridgeline, and Abel crept close enough for me to finally study him properly under real light instead of moonlight and panic. He stood nearly 6 feet tall when fully upright, though he rarely stayed that way long, because the posture looked uncomfortable for him. The body structure blended canine and primate in ways that made my brain resist what my eyes clearly saw. Long forearms, narrow waist, powerful thighs. Hands almost human except for the black curved claws extending from each finger. But the face. The face was where reality broke apart. Not wolf, not man. Something balanced horribly between both. The eyes carried too much awareness. He watched me clean fish with focused concentration, head tilting slightly each time I removed bones from the flesh, and eventually he made a low questioning sound from deep in his throat. "You want one without bones." I said it casually before realizing how absurd the sentence sounded. Still, I removed the spine carefully and tossed the cleaned trout toward him. Abel caught it instantly, then looked directly at me before eating. Not because he feared poison, because he understood offering. That was the first moment genuine affection entered the story. You can judge me for that if you want. Lord knows I have judged myself enough over the years. But human beings are built for connection, and isolation makes us reckless in ways civilization rarely sees. After enough empty winters, a kind gesture starts feeling sacred no matter who gives it. By April, the snow had retreated from lower elevations and green shoots pushed through the thawing earth around the creek beds, and those weeks became the closest thing to peace I have ever experienced since losing my family. Abel visited almost daily. Sometimes he brought objects from the forest and left them near the porch before disappearing again into the trees. Antlers, smooth stones, bird feathers. Once, an old rusted compass probably scavenged from some abandoned hunting camp decades earlier. Each object carried the same deliberate care. Trade, exchange, relationship. Cain never approached that closely, but I sensed his presence constantly. Tracks around the cabin every morning. Deep growls echoing from distant ridges at night whenever coyotes wandered too near. Twice I woke to find fresh deer carcasses left near the creek after storms damaged my hunting routes. Protection. That realization unsettled me worse than fear ever had, because predators do not protect people. Not naturally. One morning, during heavy rain, I found Abel sitting beneath the lean-to beside the cabin, watching water drip from the roof while I repaired fishing nets inside. And the sight almost looked domestic in a way that made my chest ache unexpectedly. He hated rain touching his face but loved listening to it strike the metal roof. He would sit for hours perfectly still whenever storms rolled through. That became our thing after a while. Rain and the harmonica. The harmonica mattered most. Every night after dinner I played the same old blues melody my daughter used to ask for during camping trips when she was little, and eventually Abel started appearing before I even finished the first verse. Sometimes Cain lingered farther back among the trees, listening as well. I could never fully see him, but I felt him there, watching the fire, watching me, watching Abel. There was one evening in particular I remember clearer than birthdays now. Late April, mist hanging low through the valley, frogs calling from the creek for the first time that year. I sat on the porch steps playing quietly while Abel crouched nearby, cleaning mud from a deer bone with surprising concentration. Then he made a sound. Soft, almost musical. At first I thought he was mimicking the harmonica accidentally, but after a few moments I realized he was humming along with the tune in broken, uneven notes. I stopped playing immediately. Abel stopped too. We stared at each other in silence while cold realization crept slowly through my stomach. Learning. Not instinct. Learning. I should have documented everything, recordings, samples, proper evidence. But that would have changed the relationship into an experiment. And I think some part of me desperately needed it to stay personal. That spring I started speaking to them more openly than I had spoken to another living thing in years. Little comments while chopping wood, complaints about weather, stories about wildlife survey disasters from my younger days. Oba listened constantly with that same tilted head and focused stare, while Cain remained hidden deeper in the timber. One afternoon, while repairing the generator, I caught myself saying something that still breaks my heart remembering it. "You boys are better company than most people." Abel made that soft, chuffing sound he used whenever amused. And somewhere in the trees, Cain answered with a low, rumbling growl that almost sounded like agreement. There was humor between them, too. That surprised me most. One morning, Abel stole my wool cap from the porch and sprinted halfway across the clearing while I chased him through wet grass swearing like an idiot. And the whole time Cain watched from the woods, making short, huffing noises that sounded dangerously close to laughter. I know how that sounds. Believe me. But intelligence leaves fingerprints everywhere once you start recognizing the patterns. Around May, I made the second great mistake of my life. I followed them deeper north. The weather had turned warm enough for hiking without heavy gear, and Abel kept stopping along the creek path that morning to look back at me as if wanting me to continue farther. Eventually, curiosity won over caution. That is usually how human beings die. The forest changed gradually as we moved north of the valley. Fewer birds, fewer deer trails, trees older and thicker. Several trunks carried massive claw marks nearly 8 feet high, with sap still bleeding from fresh damage. Territory markers. Warnings. At one point, Abel froze beside a muddy embankment and sniffed the air sharply before backing closer to me with visible tension spreading through his body. Seconds later, I heard movement somewhere uphill. Heavy movement. Not one creature. Several. Branches cracked in slow, deliberate intervals through the timber, while low growls echoed between the trees far enough apart to suggest distance, but close enough to surround the ravine entirely. Abel pressed against my side for the first and only time. Warm, trembling slightly, terrified. That was when Cain appeared. He stepped from the trees uphill above us with shoulders raised and lips peeled back from massive yellow teeth, while the growling around the ravine immediately stopped. Authority. That was the word that entered my mind. Cain stared into the woods for several long seconds before turning toward me. Then he made a sharp clicking sound with his teeth. Abel instantly started moving back toward the valley, and for the first time since meeting them, I obeyed without question. Because something else lived in those mountains. Something Cain himself feared. The snow came down hard 2 nights later, thick, wet flakes that clung to the cabin windows and buried the old logging road by midnight, and I remember sitting beside the stove with a dented pot of elk stew balanced across my knees, while the radio hissed useless static from Spokane because storms always swallowed the signal out there, and somewhere around 10:00 I started hearing movement again beyond the creek. Not random movement, patterned movement. Something circling. I killed the lantern and listened carefully, because that was what my training taught me to do during field surveys whenever predators moved near camp, and after a few minutes I realized the sounds carried intention behind them. One set of footsteps approached the cabin while another stayed farther back among the trees, as if standing guard. I remember feeling embarrassed by the thought at first. Guard duty belonged to soldiers and men, not animals. Still, the feeling stayed. I cracked the curtain beside the sink and saw them again. The smaller one stood near the woodpile. Even through blowing snow, I could tell it was young. Its shoulders were narrow and awkward, almost unfinished looking, but the legs bent wrong for any wolf I had ever documented. Longer in the thigh, too flexible around the joints. The fur across its chest looked pale silver beneath the moonlight. Steam rolled from its muzzle in slow bursts while it sniffed the stacked firewood. The second one remained deeper in the trees, watching. Always watching. That was the first night I noticed the eyeshine difference. The curious one reflected gold under light. The cautious one reflected pale blue. I started thinking of them that way after a while. Gold eyes and blue eyes. It felt easier than admitting I had no scientific category for what I was looking at. I should have reported the tracks immediately. Any responsible biologist would have. But isolation changes the rules inside your head after enough winters. You start protecting your loneliness because it becomes the only thing fully yours. And if I am honest with you, I already knew what would happen if outsiders came looking around those mountains. They would hunt them. People hear monster and immediately reach for rifles. That is our species in one sentence. The snowstorm strengthened through the night until wind rattled the stovepipe hard enough to shake soot loose from the ceiling, and sometime after midnight I heard scratching against the porch door. Slow scratching. Deliberate. Not aggressive. I sat frozen in the chair. The scratching came again. Then silence. I waited nearly 15 minutes before opening the door. Cold flooded inside instantly. Snow drifted halfway across the porch. The storm had erased most tracks except for a single line leading from the tree line to the cabin steps. And sitting directly outside the door was another river stone, except this one had something wrapped around it. Fishing line. Old green monofilament tangled carefully around the center groove of the rock. I stared at it for a long time before bending down, because that was not instinct, that was imitation. Something had watched human behavior closely enough to understand the idea of leaving an object intentionally. The realization unsettled me more than the creature itself. I carried the stone inside and set it beside the stove to thaw, while my mind searched desperately for explanations that fit inside reality. Escaped primates, experimental animals, some undiscovered canine mutation. Every theory collapsed under basic anatomy. No known predator moved like that. No known predator left gifts. The next morning, the storm finally cleared. Fresh powder stretched across the valley untouched except for the tracks surrounding my cabin. I spent 3 hours following them north along the creek with a field notebook in my jacket pocket and a revolver holstered under my arm, more for comfort than protection. The tracks moved in pairs. Always. One set heavier, one lighter. The stride lengths changed constantly as though they shifted between walking on 4 limbs and 2. Several times the prints vanished entirely where the creatures had climbed over deadfall or rock outcroppings with impossible ease. I measured one leap across a washed-out streambed at nearly 16 feet. No wolf on Earth makes that jump from standing position. Around noon, I found the den. Not a cave exactly, more like an abandoned ranger supply bunker buried into the hillside decades earlier and partially collapsed under old avalanche damage. Rusted metal protruded from the earth beside cedar roots. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the entrance. The smell hit first. Wet fur, rotting meat, wood smoke. That last one stopped me cold. Smoke, faint but unmistakable. I crouched outside, listening carefully while cold water soaked through my pant knees, and after several seconds I heard movement inside the bunker, followed by a low whining sound that resembled nervous dogs communicating with each other. Then a deeper growl answered from farther back, protective, warning. I should have left then. Instead, I reached into my pack and removed half the smoked trout I had carried for lunch. Looking back now, I understand exactly why I did it. Grief recognizes grief. Loneliness recognizes loneliness. Those creatures were hiding from the world the same way I was. I placed the trout near the entrance and backed away slowly. Nothing emerged. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something hanging from a branch beside the bunker. A deer vertebra threaded carefully onto fishing line, like decoration or warning. The line matched the one wrapped around the stone. That detail mattered later. Everything mattered later. For the next several weeks, I established routines without admitting to myself that I was establishing routines. I left scraps near the creek after hunting trips. Sometimes rabbit, sometimes trout, once part of a venison roast after a successful mule deer harvest. The food always vanished overnight, and every few days another stone appeared near the porch. Different sizes, different colors, always smooth, always placed carefully where I would notice. You spend enough years studying animal cognition and you begin recognizing intentional exchange patterns. Ravens do it. Dolphins do it. Certain primates absolutely do it. But this felt personal. The first direct contact happened during late February while freezing fog rolled through the valley thick enough to hide the trees entirely beyond 30 yards. I was splitting firewood near dusk when the younger one stepped from the fog without warning. Close enough for me to smell it. God, that smell. Wet cedar bark. Old blood. Cold earth after rain. The creature stood hunched at first with one long arm hanging lower than the other. Its fur looked denser around the neck and shoulders, almost mane-like in patches. Scars crossed the muzzle. Fresh ones. Young male, probably, though even now I hate using animal terms for them. It watched me split wood for nearly a minute without moving. I remember setting the axe down very slowly because sudden movements felt dangerous in a way I cannot fully explain. Then the creature looked toward the stacked logs beside the cabin, back toward me, then toward the logs again. I almost laughed from nerves. "You want to help, buddy?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, and to my astonishment the creature approached the woodpile, grabbed a fallen log with both hands, and carried it directly to the porch. Not because it feared me, not because it wanted food, but because it understood the task. That moment changed everything, because monsters are easier when they stay monsters. The second you recognize intention inside their eyes, the whole world starts becoming unstable. For the next hour, we carried wood together in silence, while freezing fog drifted through the trees around us, and daylight slowly faded from silver into blue. The creature never came within arm's reach, but each trip brought it slightly closer to the porch light. At one point, it paused beside the harmonica hanging from a nail near the doorway. My daughter's harmonica. The only thing of hers I still carried everywhere. The creature touched it carefully with one clawed finger, then looked at me. I should have known right then that intelligence changes the rules of fear forever. The last autumn I spent in that valley arrived quietly, with cold rain sliding through the cedar branches for days at a time, while fog gathered low across the creek beds every morning, like smoke from unseen fires. And by then, I already understood the story could only end one way, because wilderness does not allow unnatural arrangements to survive forever, no matter how much affection grows inside them. Everything borrowed from nature eventually gets reclaimed. Even loneliness. Especially loneliness. Abel changed more during that final year than during all the months before it combined. The softness that once defined him around the cabin faded gradually beneath something older and harder settling into his behavior. He still returned before dawn after ranging through the mountains at night, but the injuries became more frequent afterward. Fresh scars across the chest, bites along the forearms, one torn ear that never healed properly, territory fights, challenges, preparation, and beneath all of it, I sensed the same terrible truth growing clearer every day. The others were waiting for him. Not hunting him anymore, waiting. There were evenings when he stood outside the outpost staring north for hours, while cold wind moved through the trees around us, carrying distant howls from the ridges. And during those moments he looked less like the curious creature who once hummed beside my harmonica, and more like something ancient, remembering where it belonged. I hated myself for resenting that, because deep down I knew the selfishness hiding underneath my fear. I did not want him to leave. Not because the valley would become dangerous afterward, because I would become alone again. That is the ugliest thing isolation does to people. It turns companionship into survival. It convinces you love means keeping something close even when keeping it close damages both of you. The realization came slowly during those final months. Abel had not stayed because he needed protection anymore. He stayed because Cain died protecting me. Debt, loyalty, family obligation carried across species in ways no scientific language could properly explain. One evening in early October, we sat outside beside a small fire, while freezing rain tapped softly against the surrounding trees, and Abel rested near the flames, turning one of Cain's old river stones carefully between his claws, while I played the harmonica for the first time in weeks. The same melody. Always the same melody. The notes sounded weaker now because age had stiffened my lungs, and arthritis burned through my hands during cold weather, but Abel still listened with the same focused stillness he carried from the beginning. Then, halfway through the song, he looked toward me suddenly. Not through me, toward me. And very softly he made a sound. Robert. I stopped playing instantly. The harmonica slipped from my hands into the dirt beside the fire. Abel lowered his head afterward, as though startled by his own voice, but I sat there frozen while rain hissed against the flames, because hearing my name from him felt completely different than hearing it from the scarred creature months earlier. Not imitation, recognition, personal. He knew who I was, not prey, not caretaker. Robert. Nothing in my education prepared me for the emotional violence of that moment. People imagine discovery as excitement, wonder, triumph. But genuine paradigm shifts arrive uglier than that. They tear through your understanding of reality so violently that grief follows immediately behind them. Because once you know something impossible is real, you also understand how fragile every certainty around it becomes. I remember laughing quietly after the shock faded a little. Not because anything felt funny, because the human mind breaks pressure through strange little cracks. I told Abel nobody on the internet would believe any of this if I ever tried explaining it publicly, and he tilted his head the way he always did whenever confused by my rambling references to modern life and technology. "You are lucky," I said. "You never had to learn what social media is." Abel made that low chuffing sound again, almost amused, and for a few minutes the darkness lifted enough that the old warmth returned between us. That was the last peaceful night we ever had. 3 days later, the first bodies appeared. Not disappearances. Bodies. A hunting party from a neighboring county crossed too far north during elk season and wandered into territory they did not understand. Rangers found the remains scattered across a logging road after sunrise beneath heavy fog. The sheriff came to the outpost himself afterward. No deputies this time, no jokes, no selective blindness. Just exhaustion carved deep into an aging man's face. He stood beside the doorway while Abel remained hidden somewhere beyond the trees, watching silently. "You know something, Robert." Not a question. Rain dripped steadily from the brim of his hat, while distant thunder rolled through the mountains beyond us. I looked toward the northern ridges automatically, then back at him, and for the first time in my life I understood certain truths become dangerous the second they leave your mouth. Not because people will not believe them, because some part of them already does. The sheriff studied me quietly for several seconds. Then he sighed. My grandfather used to talk about things in these mountains. Said the old tribes avoided certain valleys after dark. Said miners vanished up north long before roads reached this place. He paused there, watching my face carefully. I think he wanted confirmation. Instead, I asked him a question. Why stay? The sheriff looked out toward the forest. Same reason you did probably. Lonely men get attached to places that scare everyone else away. Then he left. That conversation haunted me afterward because it confirmed something I had resisted accepting all along. Humanity already knew. At least pieces of it. Stories survive generations for reasons. Warnings become folklore when people stop listening directly. The attacks worsened through late October. Livestock slaughtered near isolated ranches. Campgrounds abandoned overnight. Search helicopters combing sections of wilderness farther north, while officials blamed rogue bears publicly to avoid panic. But panic spread anyway. Fear recognizes itself even when authorities rename it. Abel grew increasingly restless during those weeks. Several nights he returned after dawn instead of before it, covered in blood and smelling of wet earth and pine sap, while distant howls echoed through the mountains behind him. The rule had started breaking. Always. Always. Until suddenly, not always anymore. I knew what that meant long before admitting it aloud. The valley was changing hands. One freezing night near the end of November, I woke because Abel stood beside the bed, staring toward the doorway exactly the same way he had before the scarred creature found the outpost during winter. Except this time, he was not afraid. He was listening. Outside, the wind moved softly through falling snow, while moonlight painted the clearing silver beyond the windows. Then came the howl. Deep, layered, close. Abel answered immediately. Not mournful, not defensive. Certain. The sound rolled out across the valley powerful enough to vibrate through the walls themselves, and afterward silence settled over the mountains so completely that even the storm seemed to pause around it. Then Abel looked back at me, and I understood. The moment had finally arrived. He stepped toward the doorway slowly. I remember standing there unable to speak, because grief had already started before anything was actually gone. Funny thing about attachment. Sometimes the pain begins the second you realize something no longer belongs beside you. I finally managed one sentence. You do not have to go. Abel stared at me for several long seconds. Then very softly, he made that broken humming sound again, the first notes of the harmonica melody. Our thing. Rain and music, the beginning, the middle, the end. Then he turned and walked into the snow. No dramatic farewell, no final glance back. Just a massive shape disappearing quietly among the trees where the others waited somewhere beyond sight. I followed as far as Cain's grave before stopping. The valley stretched silent around me beneath moonlight and falling snow, while distant figures moved between the pines far north along the ridges. Several shapes, one larger than the others. Abel never looked back again. But just before the forest swallowed them completely, a single howl echoed through the mountains carrying a tone I had never heard before. Not warning, not grief, acceptance. After that winter, the attacks stopped almost entirely. Missing livestock became rare. Campers passed through lower trails safely again. The pressure inside the wilderness eased little by little until the mountains started feeling ordinary to outsiders once more. But sometimes during heavy storms I still hear distant howls rolling across the ridges late at night. And every now and then I find smooth river stones left near the old grave beside the creek. Gray. White stripe through the center. Always clean, always deliberate. People ask me now, usually after enough whiskey loosens old memories loose from my throat, whether I think those creatures are evil. Wrong question. Bears kill people too. Wolves kill people. Human beings kill each other more efficiently than anything else ever born on this planet. The real question is whether intelligence automatically makes something monstrous once it learns violence. And after everything I saw in those mountains, I do not think the answer separates us from them nearly as much as we want it to. Because the truth I carried out of that valley was not that monsters exist in the wilderness. It was that loneliness can make two different species recognize each other long before either one understands the cost of being seen.